The rain had been falling on Cedar Hollow, Tennessee for 3 days straight. When Wade Coleman pulled his truck into the gravel lot of the county animal shelter, and he told himself he was only there to drop off his daughter, nothing more. He had no intention of going inside. He had no intention of looking at anything with 4 legs and a heartbeat. But the moment he stepped through those glass doors, one small mud-colored dog crossed the entire length of the room and sat down on his boot like it had been waiting its whole short life for him to arrive. And from a kennel at the far end of the hall, a second dog watched him without moving, without blinking, holding so still it seemed carved from the shadows it sat in. One came running. One refused to come at all. Wade had no way of knowing that before the week was over, both of them would crack open a door. Inside him he had welded shut years ago, and walk straight into the dark he kept locked behind it. Wade was 61 years old, and people who met him for the first time tended to lower their voices without knowing why. He stood a shade over 6 feet, still broad through the shoulders the way a man stays broad, when the strength was earned and never quite leaves, his gray hair cut close to the scalp out of a habit older than memory. There was a stillness to him that read as coldness to strangers, and as something else entirely to anyone who had ever come home from a war. His eyes were a flat, weathered gray, the color of a lake under a low sky, and they moved across a room before the rest of him did, marking doors and corners and the distance to every exit. He had been a Navy SEAL for the better part of 2 decades, and the Navy had taught him 100 ways to stay alive, and not one single way to live afterward. He had a cabin on the backside of Coleman Ridge, land that had carried his family's name since before the Civil War, and he had spent the last 4 years up there in a quiet so complete it had started to feel like a held breath. He worked nights at a lumber yard down in the valley because the dark suited him, and the silence didn't ask questions. He drank his coffee black. He kept his doors locked. He called all of it peace because the real name for it scared him too much to say. His daughter Lena was the one who dragged him down the mountain that afternoon. She was 34, small and quick where he was large and slow, with her mother's dark hair and her mother's stubborn refusal to let a hard thing stay hard. She taught 3rd grade at the elementary school and spent her weekends volunteering anywhere. A person or an animal needed somebody to remember they existed. Lena had been trying for 2 years to get her father to do something other than work and sleep and stare at the tree line, and she had finally found her opening when the shelter put out a call for foster homes. She hadn't asked him to foster. She was smarter than that. She'd asked him to drive her, knowing the man couldn't say no to a favor even when he could say no to everything else. "You don't have to go in," she'd told him in the truck, watching the wipers drag across the glass. "Just wait here if you want." "I'm not sitting in the rain like a dog," Wade had said. Lena had smiled at that, the small private smile she got when something was going exactly the way she'd planned, and she hadn't said a word. The shelter smelled like every shelter. Bleach laid over the deeper smell of fear and wet fur and animals that had learned not to hope too loud. A woman came out from behind the desk to meet them, and Wade clocked her the way he clocked everyone, in a single pass that took half a second and gave nothing back. She was somewhere in her late 40s, with copper hair going gray at the temples, pulled into a knot that had given up around the edges, and a tired kindness in her face that hadn't curdled into anything bitter, which Wade respected without meaning to. Her name was Frances Holloway, and she ran the place on a county budget that wouldn't have covered the heating bill, and she had the particular calm of a person who had buried a great deal and kept showing up anyway. That was when the small one came at him. The dog couldn't have been more than 9 weeks old, some hopeful accident of a hound and a shepherd, and God only knew what else. The color of dried mud with one ear that stood up, and one that flopped over like it couldn't be bothered. It came across the concrete floor at a dead sprint, all loose skin and oversized paws, skidded the last 2 feet on its rump, and arrived at Wade's boot with the triumphant expression of a creature that had completed a long and dangerous journey. Then it grabbed his bootlace in its teeth and began to pull, growling, throwing its whole tiny body backward against the project. Lena laughed out loud. "Oh no, oh Dad, he picked you. He picked my shoe," Wade said. The puppy lost its grip, tumbled over backward, sneezed, and immediately came back for the lace with renewed conviction, as though the fall had been a tactical decision. Frances was watching from a few feet off, and something in her had gone soft. "That one's a menace," she said with affection. "Came in 2 weeks ago with his brother. We've been calling him Biscuit because he'll eat anything that isn't nailed down." "And the brother?" Lena asked. Frances's smile thinned. She nodded toward the far end of the hall. In the last kennel, pressed into the corner where 2 walls met, sat the other dog. Same litter, anyone could see it. The same long legs, the same 2 big paws. But where the first dog was all motion and noise, this one was carved out of stillness. He was darker, nearly black across the back, with rust-colored markings on his legs that the gray light barely caught. His ears were half up, listening. His eyes were a deep amber, and they were fixed on Wade with an attention so complete it raised the hair on the back of the old man's neck. The dog didn't bark. He didn't wag. He simply watched, the way a sentry watches a tree line, weighing whether the thing that just walked in was a threat or a chance. And not yet willing to bet his life on either. "That's Scout," Frances said quietly. "We don't really know what happened to him. Animal control pulled them both out from under a collapsed barn out past the river after that bad freeze. Best we can figure, they were on their own a while." The little one bounced right back. "Scout." She stopped, choosing her words the way you'd choose your footing on ice. Scout decided early that the world wasn't safe, and nothing's talked him out of it yet. He won't take food from a hand, he won't let you reach over him. He only eats once Biscuit's already eating, like he's standing guard. Wade said nothing. He was looking at the dark dog in the corner, and the dark dog was looking back at him, and something passed between them in the cold fluorescent silence that Wade did not have a word for and did not want one. He knew that posture. He knew that way of sitting with your back to the wall and the door in your sight line. He had sat that way in airports and waiting rooms and at his own mother's funeral. He had spent 4 years arranging the furniture of his life so that he would never have to sit any other way. "The shelter's overcapacity," Frances went on, gentle but not soft. "I've got 2 families circling for Biscuit. Everybody wants the friendly one. Nobody's asked about Scout. If I can't move them together by the end of the week, I have to split them up. And I'll be honest with you, when I split a pair like this, the quiet one usually doesn't do well." She let that sit. She didn't push it. She was too good at her job to push it. "I'd take both myself, but I've got 6 at home already, and a landlord who's run out of patience." Biscuit had given up on the lace and was now lying across Wade's boot entirely, belly up, having declared the boot conquered and himself the rightful king of it. Down the hall, Scout had not moved, but his eyes had, tracking from Wade's face to the small dog draped over his foot and back again, doing some arithmetic that no one in the room could read. "I don't keep dogs," Wade said. Nobody argued with him. Lena looked at her shoes. Frances nodded like she'd expected it. And somehow the silence agreeing with him was worse than any argument could have been. Because in it Wade could hear, very faintly, the sound of a door he'd thought was sealed beginning to give at the hinge. He thought about it the whole drive back up the mountain. He thought about it through his shift at the lumber yard, where he caught himself standing under the loading lights. At 2 in the morning, doing nothing at all. Just staring at the rain, coming down sideways through the floodlights. He thought about the dark dog sitting with his back to the wall, eating only after his brother ate, standing guard over a danger that lived only in his own small ruined memory. He thought about a name he hadn't let himself say out loud in 4 years, and he made himself stop thinking entirely, and the not thinking was its own kind of noise. He was back at the shelter when it opened the next morning. He didn't have a reason ready, so he didn't offer one, and Frances was kind enough not to make him find one. She just handed him the clipboard. He signed his name on the foster line, then crossed it out and signed the adoption line instead. Because a man who had spent his life refusing to do things halfway was not about to start with this. He paid the fee. He took the 2 collars she slid across the counter, a blue one and a faded green one, and he carried both dogs out to the truck in the rain, one under each arm, Biscuit squirming and licking and committing acts of joy against the side of his face, Scout rigid and silent, his small heart hammering so hard, Wade could feel it through his coat sleeve, like a bird trapped in a wall. The cabin had been a clean and quiet and orderly place for 4 years, and the 2 dogs ended that within an hour. Biscuit went through it like weather, knocking over the kindling bucket, attacking the corner of the rug, drowning himself enthusiastically in the water bowl, and then looking betrayed about it. Wade found himself talking to the dog before he'd realized he was doing it, low and dry, calling him a disgrace and a vandal, and the dog took every insult as the highest possible praise. But it was Scout who Wade couldn't stop watching. The dark dog crept the perimeter of the main room one slow step at a time, nose working, and then settled himself in the narrow gap between the wood stove and the bookcase, in the one spot in the whole cabin from which he could see the front door, the hall, and the man, all at once. Wade recognized the choice. He'd made the same one in 100 rooms. He didn't crowd the dog. He remembered what Francis had told him. Let him pick the distance. And so he lowered himself down onto the floor with his back against the cabinet, his bad knee complaining the whole way, and he set a dish of softened food a few feet out, and then looked at the window instead, pretending with everything he had that he didn't care whether the dog ate or not. It took 20 minutes. Then Scout crept forward, took one bite, froze like the room might punish him for needing it, and took another. Wade kept his eyes on the rain. He did not say a word, but something in his chest that had been clenched into a fist for 4 years, loosened by the width of a single finger, and he was old enough and honest enough to know that it had. Lena started coming around more after that, with groceries and dog food, and the transparent excuses of a woman watching a plan come to fruit. Francis came too, twice the first week to check on Scout's progress, and then a third time for a reason that didn't quite hold together when you looked at it directly. The weeks went on. Spring tried and failed and tried again to take hold of the ridge. Biscuit grew louder and rounder and more convinced of his own importance, and Scout grew slower, quieter, but unmistakably less afraid. He stopped hugging the walls. He started sleeping with both eyes closed. He began, in the evenings, to cross the room and lie down a few feet from Wade's chair, not touching, not yet. The dog still had his dignity, but close enough that his presence was a thing Wade could feel. And then came the night Scout led him to the door. It was late and the fire had burned down to coals, and Wade noticed Scout was gone from his usual spot. He found the dog at the end of the hall, lying with his chin on his paws in front of a door Wade had not opened in 4 years. He didn't scratch at it. He didn't whine. He just lay there in front of it, waiting like he'd been posted there. "There's nothing in there for you," Wade said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. The dog didn't move, and Wade stood in that dark hallway and felt the old pressure climb up the back of his neck, because the dog wasn't demanding anything, wasn't clawing or begging, was only keeping watch over a wound the animal couldn't possibly understand and somehow understood completely. Wade put his hand on the cold doorknob, and he stood there long enough for the wind to shake the window at the end of the hall, and then he turned it. The room smelled of dust and cardboard and, under that, something faintly like canvas and gun oil that his body recognized before his mind did. He didn't turn on the light. The coals from the front room threw just enough glow to find the shapes. The footlocker, the folded uniform sealed in plastic, the boxes he'd stacked and never opened, and on top of the footlocker, wrapped in a square of olive cloth he'd folded with his own hands, a worn nylon working collar, military issue, the buckle gone dull. Scout came into the room behind him, slow and careful, and did not explore. He came to Wade's side and sat, his shoulder leaning the faintest pressure against the old man's leg. The collar had belonged to a dog named Ranger. Wade made himself form the name in his head, and the name nearly took his legs out from under him. Ranger had been a Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, 80 pounds of muscle and teeth, and a loyalty so total it embarrassed the men around him. He had not been Wade's pet. He had been Wade's partner across 2 deployments, the dog who walked point so the men didn't have to, who could find what no instrument could find, who had once stolen an entire roast chicken off a forward operating base table and sat beside the bones looking so pleased with himself that a hardened Master Chief had laughed until he cried. On their last patrol, Ranger had found the thing in the road that the men had missed. He'd alerted. He'd put his own body between the danger and the line of men behind him. And the men had walked home and the dog had not. And Wade had carried that arithmetic for 4 years, and never once been able to make it come out even. He had folded the collar into a cloth and folded the cloth into a locker, and folded the whole truth into a room at the end of a hall, and called the silence peace. He went down onto the dusty floor with the collar in his hands, and the man who hadn't cried at 2 funerals, and a divorce, cried then, silently, his shoulders moving once, and then again like a mountain, trying not to come apart where anyone could see. Scout did not flinch from it. The dark dog lay down against Wade's hip, pressed his weight there, solid and warm and breathing, and stayed. He did not fix anything. He did not give anything back. He only refused to leave, and somehow that was the only thing in 4 years that had reached the bottom of it. The hard freeze came late that year, the way the worst things often do, after everyone stopped expecting them. A storm rolled up the valley one evening with no manners and no warning, dropping the temperature 30 degrees in an hour, and throwing wet snow against the cabin until the windows went white. Wade was bringing in firewood when the deer broke from the tree line, a yearling, thin and panicked, driven down out of the high country by the cold. It crossed the yard in 3 long bounds, and Biscuit, who had nosed the door open behind Wade with the genius of a criminal and the judgment of a soup spoon, took one look at the deer and exploded into the storm after it, barking with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a fool who has found his life's purpose. "Biscuit! No!" The wind tore the words apart before they cleared his mouth, and then Scout went out the door. For half a second, Wade braced for the dog to freeze. The careful dog, the wall-hugging dog, the dog who weighed every open space before crossing it. But Scout didn't hesitate. He launched himself off the porch and into the white, head low, cutting through the wind, not chasing the deer at all, but chasing his brother, and the 2 of them vanished into the trees inside of 10 seconds. Wade's stomach dropped through the floor of the world. He went after them on a ruined knee and 4 years of rust, calling both names until his throat tore, and the forest took every sound and gave back nothing. He called his daughter with numb fingers. Lena didn't waste a breath on fear. "I'm calling Francis. We're coming." And Wade pushed on into the dark with a flashlight that lit up nothing but falling snow, following paw prints that filled in almost as fast as he found them. It was the memory of Ranger that drove him through it. Not the grief this time, but the fury. The helpless, familiar fury of being 1 step behind, of arriving too late, of standing over a thing he loved and not being able to undo a single second of it. Not again. He said it out loud into the storm, and the mountain, as ever, made him no promises at all. Lena's flashlight found him near the creek, and then Francis came up from the lower road in a coat too thin for the weather, calling the dogs low and soft the way you call animals you don't want to spook deeper into the dark. Hours bled together. Wade went down hard on a buried root and got up before the pain could finish introducing itself. And then, near midnight, when the whole world had narrowed to the cone of his light and the sound of his own breathing, he heard it, not a bark, but a thin, broken whimper, almost lost under the wind. He swung the light toward a deadfall pine half drifted over, and there in the lee of it he found them. Biscuit's face lifted weakly. His eyes gone dull with cold, his whole body shaking so hard, his teeth knocked together, and wrapped around the small dog, curved into a living wall between his brother and the wind, his dark coat packed solid with snow and his amber eyes open and watching, was Scout. He had not run from the cold. He had carried his fear straight into the heart of it and lain down in the worst of it and put his own body between the storm and the only family he had, and he was still there, still guarding, refusing the night one last cruelty. Wade made a sound that wasn't a word. He gathered both dogs against his chest, Biscuit feebly trying to climb him. Scout limp except for the press of his muzzle into the old man's coat, and Wade held them the way he had not been able to hold the thing he'd lost. And he understood, kneeling there with the snow driving down around the 3 of them, that the most frightened heart in his house had become the bravest one on the mountain. Both dogs came through it. Biscuit recovered with the shameless speed of the young and stupid, wrapped in blankets by the fire one day, and stealing those same blankets off his brother the next. Scout took longer, the way brave things take longer once they've spent everything they had. The valley vet, a sharp-eyed woman who scolded Wade for the state of his knee while warming a puppy inside her coat, said the dogs were lucky, and then told him to his face that luck was not a care plan. And Wade took 3 pages of instructions without arguing for the first time in his adult life. And on the 3rd evening after, when the wind had finally laid down and the fire had burned low, Scout rose from his blanket, crossed the room with a slow and total certainty, and laid his head on Wade's knee. Wade went still as a man who's had something wholly set in his lap without warning. He put his scarred hand on the dog's dark head. Neither of them moved for a long while. From the hearth, Biscuit snored like a broken outboard motor, and Wade Coleman, who had survived a war and a marriage and a grief he'd never given a name, started, very quietly, to laugh. Francis was at the cabin more and more as the snow gave way. It started as medical follow-ups and slid into coffee on the porch step, and stories that ran longer than they had any practical need to. She never pushed her way into him. She just kept appearing at the edges of his life with the patience of a woman who'd learned that the wounded come in on their own time or not at all. He told her about Ranger one afternoon, not all of it, but more than he'd told another living soul, and she didn't decorate it with pity, just sat there with her coffee going cold and let it be the size it actually was. Maybe Scout knew there was a door you couldn't open by yourself, she said. Wade looked down the hall where that door stood cracked open, now the dust cleaned out, 2 photographs framed. Ranger's collar resting in a small wooden box on a shelf where the late sun could find it. He's a dog, Wade said. Dogs, Francis said, know a good deal more than we give them credit for. And as if to argue the point, Biscuit ran full speed into the leg of the table, sneezed, and continued on undeterred, and the two of them laughed, and Wade did not look away from her when he did it. It was Lena who got him to the Veterans Hall. She didn't ask, because she knew better than to ask. She just left a flyer on his kitchen table about a meet and greet for the shelter, and said the dogs would do more good in that room than he could imagine. He told her it was a conspiracy. She told him it was a family tradition. He went. The hall was a low brick building, with a flag snapping out front, full of men who carried their wars in their shoulders, some laughing too loud and some standing apart, and some wearing caps that named ships and units like small portable headstones. Biscuit became a legend in under 10 minutes by stealing a cookie off a paper plate and then sitting on it while feigning innocence. And Scout. Scout left Wade's side without being asked, crossed that whole room of strangers, and lay down beside the wheelchair of an old man sitting alone by the window. The man was past 90, a Korea veteran, whose hands shook too badly now to hold the coffee somebody had set in front of him, and whose pale eyes had been fixed for the last hour on something none of the rest of them could see. He looked down at the dark dog, who had come to rest against his wheel. His trembling hand came down onto Scout's head, and the old man's face, which had not moved in an hour, came apart all at once, slow tears tracking down the deep folds of it. Had a dog over there, he whispered, to no one, to all of them, to the dog. Wouldn't leave me neither. The room went quiet around them, the way a room does when it understands it's standing near something it has no business interrupting. And Wade stood across that hall with Biscuit's leash slack in his hand and his own heart laid open in his chest. And he understood at last that the thing the dogs had done for him was not a thing they would only ever do once. Pain didn't vanish because a man hid it well. It only waited in darker rooms. But sometimes, if a living creature was patient enough to lie down beside it, the pain remembered how to breathe. By the time the dogwoods bloomed along Coleman Ridge, the cabin no longer looked like a place where a man was waiting to die quietly. 2 water bowls by the back door, a wreckage of chew toys by the hearth, mud on the porch boards and dark hairs on every pair of pants Wade owned, and 1 sock that had been missing since February and would, all parties understood, never be found. The door at the end of the hall stayed open most days now. Wade hadn't made a shrine of it, and he hadn't pretended it stopped hurting, but he'd opened the window and let the light in, and that was further than he'd been able to go alone. Lena came by with bread still warm from her oven, filling the kitchen with a noise the house had forgotten how to make. Frances came by too, and somewhere along the way nobody bothered to mark she stopped being a visitor. And the 2 dogs that nobody but a lonely old man had wanted lay sprawled in the dogwood shade, Biscuit on his back, with his tongue lolling out like a king, felled by his own contentment. Scout across Wade's boots with one ear swiveling toward every sound in the woods, but his body finally fully at rest. Wade sat on the porch step one evening, with the ridge rolling green and gold below him, and Frances beside him close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his, and he realized he had stopped. At some point he couldn't name, counting the exits. He thought of the day he'd stood in that shelter and announced he didn't keep dogs. He thought of Ranger walking point so the men wouldn't have to. He thought of the locked room and the snowstorm and the old man's shaking hand against Scout's dark head. He had spent his whole life believing that survival was the highest form of courage, that a man who made it through was a man who'd won. But sitting there in the long, clean light with his daughter laughing somewhere behind him, and a good woman at his side, and one ridiculous dog snoring, and one quiet dog resting unafraid against his feet. Wade Coleman finally understood the thing. 2 abandoned animals had carried up his mountain and laid at his door. Surviving was just making it to morning. Living was having someone to come home to, and a door you didn't have to keep locked, and a heart brave enough to open back up after everything it had cost you the first time. He had believed he was rescuing 2 dogs nobody else would take. He never once suspected that they had been sent up that mountain to rescue the parts of him that grief had buried alive, and that grace, when it finally came for him, would come not in thunder or in light, but on 4 muddy paws, with frightened eyes and a wagging tail and a quiet, stubborn heart that simply refused to leave.